In 1934, a coal miner's wife in Harlan County, Kentucky, fed her family of 9 on less than $2 a week. No store-bought anything, just what the garden gave, the hog provided, and the mountains offered for free. Most people think mountain folk ate possum and squirrel and called it a life. The truth is richer than that. Number 14 kept entire hollows alive through winters that would break a modern family. Number 3 was the centerpiece of every mountain wedding for 100 years. And number 1 fed more Appalachian children than any government program ever did. These 25 suppers built this country, then fast food made us forget them. Hit subscribe and let us count down. Number 25, cornbread and milk. This was the meal that said the day was done and the money was thin. A wedge of cold cornbread left over from supper, crumbled into a glass of buttermilk or sweet milk, eaten with a spoon on the porch as the light went out of the holler. That was it. In cabins across West Virginia and eastern Kentucky, this was what children ate before bed and what old men ate when their teeth were gone. The cornbread softened in the milk until it turned to something between porridge and pudding, slightly sour from the buttermilk, faintly sweet from the corn. A pound of cornbread cost almost nothing. The meal ground at the local mill. The milk from the one cow tied out back. For a family with little else, this was supper, and nobody at the table felt cheated. It was warm in the belly and asked nothing of a tired woman at the end of a long day. Number 24, fried potatoes and onions. In the mountains, this was not a side dish you put next to a steak. This was the whole meal. A cast iron skillet, a slick of bacon grease saved in a can on the back of the stove, and a pile of potatoes sliced thin with a sharp knife and a steady hand. An onion went in if there was one, cut into rings that softened and caramelized into the starch. The cook let them sit, did not stir them too much, and let a brown crust form on the bottom before turning them. The smell of frying potatoes and onion in pork fat brought children running up from the creek. A bushel of potatoes from the garden lasted all winter and cost nothing but the labor of digging them. Served with cornbread and maybe a sliced raw tomato in summer, this was Tuesday and Thursday and most nights between. It was filling, cheap, and tasted like home in a way nothing in a box ever has. Number 23, killed lettuce. This is where mountain cooking starts to look like genius. In late spring, when the leaf lettuce came up tender in the garden, a mountain woman would tear it into a bowl with a few green onions pulled straight from the dirt. Then, in the skillet, she heated bacon grease until it nearly smoked, splashed in apple cider vinegar and a pinch of sugar, and let the whole thing bubble and spit. She poured that scalding dressing directly over the raw greens, and you could hear it. The lettuce wilted instantly, going soft and glossy, the vinegar cutting the fat, the bacon grease coating every leaf in something rich and smoky. They called it killed lettuce, and it appeared on tables across Tennessee and North Carolina for the few weeks the lettuce was right. Served with cornbread and pinto beans, it was a full supper on a warm evening. City chefs serve warm bacon dressing now and charge for it. Mountain folk were doing it with skillet grease before anyone wrote it down. Number 22, stewed tomatoes. When the garden came in heavy in August, a mountain family ate tomatoes until they could not stand the sight of them, and then they canned the rest. But stewed tomatoes were their own supper. Whole tomatoes, skinned and broken up by hand, simmered slow with torn bread, or a spoonful of sugar, and a knob of butter or bacon grease, salt and pepper at the end. The bread melted into the tomatoes and thickened them into something soft and sweet and tangy all at once. A jar of home-canned tomatoes pulled from the cellar in February tasted like summer in the middle of a gray mountain winter. It cost nothing because the tomatoes were grown out back and put up by the dozens of quarts. Children who would not touch a raw tomato ate 2 bowls of this, and it carried a family through the months when nothing green grew on the mountain. Number 21, fried cornmeal mush. When the meal barrel was getting low and payday was still days off, cornmeal mush stretched almost nothing into supper. The cook boiled cornmeal in salted water, stirring until it thickened into a heavy porridge, and ate it hot with a little molasses or bacon grease. But the real mountain trick was what came next. The leftover mush was poured into a loaf pan and set in the cold pantry overnight until it firmed up solid. The next morning it was sliced thick, dredged in a little more meal, and fried in hot grease until each side turned deep brown and crisp. A sack of cornmeal cost a fraction of wheat flour and went twice as far. The dish was plain, even boring, but it stuck to your ribs and burned slow through a hard morning's work. When everything else ran out, there was still mush. Number 20, sawmill gravy and biscuits. Out at the lumber camps and in every cabin near them, this was the meal that fed working men before dawn. The cook fried a little sausage or salt pork, kept the drippings in the pan, stirred in a spoonful of flour until it browned, then poured in milk and stirred until it bubbled up thick and white. They called it sawmill gravy, and the story goes the cornmeal sometimes added to it gave it a gritty texture like sawdust. Ladled over split biscuits hot from the wood stove, it turned a few cents of flour and grease into a meal that could keep a man swinging an axe until noon. Biscuits in the mountains were made with lard and buttermilk and baked in cast iron, golden on top and tender inside. The gravy soaked down into them until biscuit and gravy became one thing. Exactly what a body needed before a day of brutal mountain labor. Number 19, fried apples. Every mountain homestead had an apple tree or 12, and in the fall, the trees gave more than anyone could eat fresh. Fried apples were the answer. Tart apples sliced with the skin on, dropped into a skillet with bacon grease or butter, brown sugar or sorghum, and a shake of cinnamon if the cook had it. They cooked down slowly until the edges caramelized and the apples went soft, dark, and syrupy. Served alongside biscuits and gravy, fried apples blurred the line between supper and dessert, which suited a family that did not waste a single thing the orchard gave. The apples too bruised or wormy to store got cut up and fried first. A bushel cost nothing off your own tree. Today it shows up as a fancy brunch side. In the mountains it was October, plain and simple, the taste of a good harvest year. Here is where things start to make sense. The first pattern break. Everything on this list so far shares one thing, and it is the secret the whole mountain table was built on. Almost nothing was bought. The Appalachian kitchen ran on a cycle that turned with the seasons, and money barely entered into it. You grew it, you raised it, you foraged it, or you went without. The garden fed you in summer. The root cellar fed you in winter. The hog, killed in November, fed you for a year. The orchard, the corn patch, the cow, the chickens, the creek, the woods. A family could live on a few dollars of store goods a year because the mountain did the rest. That is not poverty cooking the way we picture it. That is a closed system, a kind of engineering passed down by women who never wrote a recipe because they did not need to. They could feed 9 people on nothing because they understood something we traded away the moment a supermarket opened in the county seat. Number 18, leather britches. This was the trick that beat winter. Before there were freezers, before home canning was common, mountain families preserved their green beans by drying them. Whole green beans were strung on a thread with a needle, hung in long strands behind the wood stove or across the porch rafters, and left to dry until they shriveled into leathery brown ropes. They called them leather britches, or shuck beans. In the dead of winter, when nothing green was left anywhere, those dried beans were soaked overnight and then simmered for hours with a piece of fatback or a ham bone until they swelled back up tender. The flavor was nothing like a fresh bean, deeper and almost smoky, concentrated by the drying. A pot of leather britches with cornbread was a January supper that tasted like the summer garden it came from. A way to carry July all the way to March on a string behind the stove. Number 17, poke salad. In early spring, when the cellar was nearly empty and the garden had not come in yet, the mountains offered a wild green that grew along every fence row and field edge. Pokeweed. Now here is the thing every mountain cook knew that could kill you if you did not. Poke is poisonous raw, and the roots and mature leaves stay poisonous. Only the youngest spring shoots could be eaten, and only after boiling. Then the greens were fried in bacon grease, often with a scrambled egg stirred through. Poke salad was the taste of spring, the first fresh green after a long, hungry winter, and it cost nothing but the knowledge of how to handle it safely. That knowledge was life and death, passed mother to daughter for generations. We lost the plant and the wisdom both. Number 16, ramps and potatoes. Deep in the Appalachian woods, in the wet shade of early spring, the ramps came up. Wild leeks with a flavor somewhere between garlic and onion, so strong that whole communities held ramp suppers, where the whole town smelled of them for days. Mountain families dug ramps by the sackful when they appeared, knowing the window was short. The simplest and best way to eat them was fried with potatoes in bacon grease, the ramps softening and perfuming the whole skillet, the potatoes soaking up that pungent wild flavor. Sometimes eggs went in too. They cost nothing but a walk into the woods and the labor of digging. Today ramps sell for shocking prices at city farmers markets, treated as a rare delicacy. In the mountains they were free, abundant, and the unmistakable signal that winter had finally broken. Number 15, hog and hominy. When the corn crop was processed 2 ways, the mountain table never went empty. Hominy was dried corn soaked in a solution of wood ash lye or slaked lime until the tough hulls slipped off and the kernels swelled up soft and white. This was an old technique, taught to settlers by native people, that made the corn more nutritious and easier to cook. The plumped hominy was simmered with whatever pork was on hand, the fatback or the trimmings from the smokehouse, until everything melted together into a filling, starchy supper. A family that put up corn in the fall could pull hominy through the whole winter at the cost of only the corn from your own patch and the ash from your own fire. Hog and hominy was so foundational that the phrase came to mean simple, honest country food, and it fed people without a dime changing hands. Number 14, kushaw. Here is the supper that kept whole hollows alive through the hardest winters. The kushaw is a big crooked-neck squash, striped green and white, that grew enormous in mountain gardens and stored for months in a cool, dry room without spoiling. One kushaw could weigh 15 or 20 pounds and feed a family for days. Mountain cooks cut them up and baked the flesh with butter and brown sugar or sorghum until it went soft and sweet like a sweet potato. They made it into pies that tasted like pumpkin but better. They fried it, stewed it, and stretched it across the leanest weeks of the year. The kushaw was the mountain insurance policy, a vegetable you could grow huge for almost no effort and lean on all winter long, at the cost of a few seeds saved from last year's crop. When the garden was dead and the cellar thinning, the kushaw in the corner was the difference between a full table and an empty one. Almost nobody grows them anymore. Second pattern, break. Here is something the convenience economy does not want you to sit with too long. Every single dish so far was tied to the land in a way that cannot be bought back. These were not recipes you could shop for. They were the end result of a year of work that started with seeds in spring and a hog in the fall. the kushaw in the corner, the leather britches on the string, the hominy in the crock, the apples in the cellar, the cornmeal from the mill down the creek. A mountain family's pantry in January was a record of everything they had done since the previous March, and optional knowledge dies in one generation. The grandmother who could feed 9 on nothing did not pass it down because her grandchildren could drive to town and buy supper for $1. The skill that took centuries to build vanished in about 30 years, and we called it progress. Number 13, gritted bread. When the corn was not quite ripe enough to dry and grind into meal, but too mature to eat fresh off the cob, mountain cooks had a window where the kernels were soft and milky. Rather than waste that corn, they grated it. The ears were scraped against a homemade grater, often a piece of tin punched full of holes and bent over a board until the soft kernels turned to a coarse, wet pulp. That gritted corn was mixed with a little meal and salt and baked into a bread that was nothing like ordinary cornbread. Gritted bread only existed for the few weeks the corn was at exactly the right stage, which made it a small, seasonal treasure. It cost nothing but the corn from the patch and the labor of grating it, which tore up many a knuckle. Few people alive today have ever tasted it, and fewer still know how it was made. Number 12, Cracklin cornbread. Hog killing time in November was the most important week of the mountain year, and nothing went to waste. When the fat was rendered down into lard and big black kettles, what was left behind were the cracklins, the crispy browned bits of skin and fat. Those cracklins were gold. The simplest and most beloved use was to stir them into cornbread batter. The cornbread baked up in a screaming hot cast iron skillet, and the cracklins scattered through it turned crunchy and rich, little pockets of crisp pork in every bite. Cracklin cornbread with a bowl of soup beans was a supper men dreamed about, and it cost almost nothing because the cracklins were a byproduct of making the lard the family needed anyway. That cornbread, hot from the skillet with butter melting into it, was the taste of a successful hog killing, the taste of a family that would eat well that winter. Number 11, sorghum and biscuits. The mountains did not have easy access to white sugar, but nearly every community grew sorghum cane and pressed it into syrup every fall. Sorghum molasses was the mountain sweetener, thick and dark and faintly bitter, with a flavor far more complex than sugar. The simplest supper or breakfast in the world was a hot biscuit split open with butter and sorghum drizzled over it, the syrup soaking into the warm bread. For children, this was the closest thing to dessert most nights. Making sorghum was a whole community event, neighbors gathering to feed the cane through the press, an old mule walking circles to turn it, the juice boiling down for hours in a long pan over a wood fire until it thickened into syrup. A gallon of sorghum could sweeten a family's whole year, at the cost of only the cane from the patch and a day of shared labor. That biscuit with sorghum was comfort and sweetness in a life that did not offer much of either, and the taste of it still brings old mountain folk to tears. Number 10, squirrel and gravy. When fresh meat was scarce, the woods provided. Squirrel was the most common wild meat on the mountain table, plentiful in the oak and hickory forests, and a boy with a .22 caliber rifle could keep the family in meat for the price of a few cartridges. The squirrels were cleaned and cut up, then either stewed slow with dumplings until the meat fell off the bone, or fried like chicken and finished with a milk gravy made from the drippings. The meat was dark and rich, a little gamey, sweeter than chicken. Squirrel and gravy over biscuits was a real supper, not a novelty, on tables across the whole mountain south. Older squirrels needed long, slow cooking to turn tender, which is why dumplings were so common. This was protein the land gave for free to anyone willing to walk into the trees, and it fed mountain families for generations before store-bought meat was ever an option. Number 9. Souse. Hog killing meant using every part of the animal, and souse was how the head got eaten. The hog's head was simmered for hours until the meat, skin, and bits fell apart. Then it was all chopped fine, seasoned heavily with salt, black pepper, sage, and a good dose of vinegar, and packed into a mold or a bowl. As it cooled, the natural gelatin from the head set the whole thing firm, suspending the meat in a tangy, savory jelly. Sliced cold, souse was eaten on bread or with crackers, a sharp, vinegary supper that lasted in the cold pantry for weeks. Some called it head cheese, though there was no cheese in it. It cost nothing because the head would otherwise have been thrown away, and a family that had just raised a hog for a year was not about to waste anything. Modern eaters flinch at it, but souse was clever, frugal, and genuinely good. Number 8. Liver mush. In the mountains and the foothills of North Carolina especially, liver mush was the everyday cousin of souse. After the hog killing, the liver and other scrap meat were boiled, ground fine, then mixed with cornmeal and sage and black pepper, and cooked into a thick paste that was poured into loaf pans and set firm overnight. The next morning it was sliced and fried in a hot skillet until the outside turned crisp and brown, and the inside stayed soft. Fried liver mush on a biscuit with mustard was breakfast and supper both. A cheap, filling, deeply savory way to use organ meat that delivered iron and protein no muscle cut could match. A loaf cost only the scraps that came free with the hog and a little cornmeal, and it lasted a week. Liver mush is one of the few dishes here that survives in pockets today, sold in a handful of Carolina groceries. But the home version, made fresh after a family's own hog killing, has all but disappeared. Number 7. Chicken and dumplings. This was the meal that meant something. When a hen got too old to lay, she was too tough to fry, but perfect for the pot. The mountain cook simmered that old hen for hours with nothing but water and salt until the meat fell from the bones and the broth turned golden and rich with fat. Then came the dumplings. Not the puffy dropped kind from a box, but the flat-rolled kind made of flour and a little lard and broth, rolled thin, cut into squares, and dropped into the boiling pot, where they thickened everything into a stew you could stand a spoon in. Chicken and dumplings was the meal made for company, for sickness, for a death in the family, for Sunday after church. It was care you could taste. The chicken cost nothing because she was already in the yard, past her usefulness any other way, and the whole pot fed a big family and stretched into the next day. Third pattern break. Here is the part nobody says out loud about why these meals matter. They were never just about money. Yes, they were cheap. Yes, they kept families fed on almost nothing. But the deeper truth is that every one of these suppers was an act of skill and love by people who had nothing but skill and love to give. A woman who could turn a kushaw and a string of dried beans and a hog's head into a winter of meals was not poor in the way we mean it. She was rich in knowledge, rich in capability, rich in a self-reliance that does not exist anymore. When fast food came to the valleys, it did not just sell cheap meals. It sold the idea that all of this was beneath people, that cooking from scratch was something you did because you had to. And so the dumplings stopped being rolled, the gardens grew up in weeds, and a whole way of feeding a family with dignity got traded for a paper bag and a drive-through window. Number 6. Apple butter. Making apple butter was a fall ritual that pulled whole families together. Bushels of apples were cooked down in a giant copper kettle over an open fire, stirred constantly for hours with a long wooden paddle so it would not scorch. sweetened with sorghum or sugar and spiced with cinnamon and cloves. It took all day and many hands, the children taking turns stirring, the smell of cooking apples hanging over the whole homestead. What came out was dark, thick, intensely flavored apple butter that was canned and stored to last the whole year. Spread thick on a biscuit or a piece of cornbread, it was sweetness and comfort through every cold month until the next harvest. It cost only the apples off your own trees and a day of shared labor and a single kettle made enough to last a family and have plenty to give away. Apple butter was abundance you could put in a jar, the taste of a good fall, and it brought neighbors and family together in a way no purchased food ever could. Number 5. Spoon bread. This was cornbread's elegant cousin, soft enough to eat with a spoon. Where regular cornbread was firm and crumbly, spoon bread was made with more milk and beaten eggs, sometimes with the egg whites whipped and folded in, then baked until it puffed up like a soufflé, golden on top and custardy and tender beneath. You did not slice it. You spooned it out, steaming onto the plate, and topped it with butter. Spoon bread was the dish a mountain woman made when she wanted to show what she could do, refined and rich, but built from the same humble cornmeal as everything else. It cost only a little more than plain cornbread, the difference being a few eggs from the hen house and a little extra milk. Served alongside greens or beans, it turned a simple supper into something special. Spoon bread still appears now and then in southern restaurants as a heritage curiosity, but as a home supper made fresh in a wood stove on a mountain evening, it has nearly slipped out of memory. Number 4. Greens and pot liquor. If you want to understand how the mountains ate, you start here. A big mess of greens, whatever grew, creasy greens foraged from the creek banks in early spring, turnip greens and mustard greens from the garden, mountain cress and branch lettuce, all washed clean and dropped into a pot with a piece of fatback or a ham bone and just enough water to cover. Then they cooked low and slow for an hour or more until the greens went soft and dark and the water turned into pot liquor, the deeply savory, mineral-rich broth at the bottom of the pot. And the pot liquor was the whole point. Cornbread was baked specifically to crumble into it and sop it up. The greens cost almost nothing, foraged free or grown out back, and the pork scrap came from the smokehouse. Nutritionists now know greens cooked this way hold remarkable amounts of iron, calcium, and vitamins, much of it landing in the pot liquor. Mountain families knew none of the science. They just knew it kept them strong, and they were right. Number 3. Apple stack cake. Here is the dish that stood at the center of every mountain wedding for 100 years. The apple stack cake was the Appalachian celebration cake, and there is no other dessert quite like it in America. Thin layers of dense sorghum-sweetened cake, almost like a cookie, were baked one at a time, sometimes a dozen of them or more. Between each layer went a thick spread of dried apples that had been cooked down with spices into a dark, sweet, almost jam-like filling. The story goes that at a poor mountain wedding, neighbors would each bring a layer, the bride's family supplied the apple filling, and the height of the finished cake showed how loved the couple was. It cost only what each family could spare. It was generosity you could slice, a whole community's love built into a single cake. Number 2. Fatback and milk gravy. Salt-cured fatback, also called streak-o-lean when it had a ribbon of meat through it, was the workhorse of the mountain meat box. A slab of pork belly cured hard with salt could hang in the smokehouse for months without spoiling, and a little of it flavored a whole pot of beans or greens. But eaten on its own, sliced thin and fried crisp, then turned into milk gravy in the same pan with a little flour and milk, fatback became a supper in itself. It cost almost nothing because the fatback came from the family's own hog, cured by the family's own hands. This was the meat that made everything else taste like meat. The seasoning and the centerpiece both. The salty backbone of a mountain diet that ran on a single hog for an entire year. And number 1, soup beans and cornbread. There it is. The meal at the center of the whole Appalachian table. The supper that fed more mountain children than anything else ever made. A pot of dried pinto beans, soaked overnight, then simmered all day with a piece of fatback or a ham bone, salt and pepper, and nothing else. By supper time, the beans had broken down at the edges and thickened their own broth into something dark and rich they called the bean soup or the pot liquor. A skillet of cornbread baked golden while the beans cooked, and you crumbled it right into the bowl, beans and broth and cornbread together, with a slice of raw onion on the side, and maybe a few pickled things from the garden. A pound of dried beans cost almost nothing, and fed a family for 2 days. This was supper 5 and 6 nights a week in the coal camps and the hollows. The meal that built the men who dug the coal and cut the timber that powered this country. It was plain, it was endless, and it was enough. There was nothing fancy about a bowl of soup beans and cornbread. There was only a full belly, a warm kitchen, and the quiet certainty that tomorrow you could do it again. That is the meal we should remember most. Here is my challenge. Make one of these this week. Just one. The fried potatoes, the soup beans and cornbread, the fried apples. Make something your great-grandparents made without a second thought. Back when the mountain fed the family and the family fed itself. Then come back and tell me if it was as plain as you expected, because I made the soup beans and cornbread and I understood something I had been missing. Drop the one you are going to try in the comments. I want to know if the stack cake gets more love than the killed lettuce. And if anybody out there still strings their beans on a thread behind the stove. Because these were never just suppers. They were a whole way of feeding a family with dignity. And we let fast food talk us out of it.